Good morning. It's 9 o'clock. It's time to start. Welcome all of you this morning. And we're officially called to order, and the discussion is from the Audit Committee. John, I guess that's you?
Yes, sir. As a prelude, we're having some discussions, I'm having some discussions with the town manager in terms of the right of the audit committee to review any of the internal controls in the town. So with that said, if it's concluded by the LGC that we have no authority to do that as the audit committee, then some of this might become moot. But my input this morning is the audit report with respect to the town's annual financial statements for the year ended June 30th, 2017 disclosed two significant deficiencies with respect to the town's internal accounting and finance controls, financial staff competence, and procedures for financial statement preparation and presentation. The audit committee had discussions with the auditor about these matters, and the audit process.
Excuse me.
Sir,
You've got a report. May I have a copy of whatever
I
it
left one
is?
there for you. I set one on the table for you.
And I think it's in the packet.
It's
No.
in the packet.
That's not, this is.
Is this
I
a
did
different,
rewrite
you
it.
rewrote it,
I had,
okay.
based on David's input, I rewrote it.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
So each member should have a copy of this.
Sorry to
Back
interrupt
to,
you. Thank you.
yes, sir. So the audit committee had discussions with the auditor about these matters and audit process, and as part of that discussion, the audit partner recommended the town engage a consultant to perform a comprehensive review of its internal accounting and financial controls. The North Carolina Local Government Commission recommends such an external review be accomplished periodically. The current external audit firm has conducted an annual audit for 6 years. It is recommended by the LGC and it's common practice to rotate audit firms periodically to increase the likelihood of independence of the auditor. The town manager advised last night that the North Carolina statutes require the LGC conduct any internal reviews and that towns are forbidden to contract with an independent internal control review. Accordingly, the Board of Commissioners should, as early as possible, be asked to direct the chair of the audit committee to, 1, request the town clerk send a request for quotations to a wide range of qualified and experienced accounting firms qualified to conduct the town's 2018 annual audit of financial statements, and 2, review applications submitted and choose the firm to conduct the 2018 audit subject to confirmation by the Board of Commissioners. B, direct the town manager, if the town is forbidden to contract with an outside firm to conduct the review, to request the local government commission to appoint a team of LGC professionals to conduct internal, in-depth accounting and financial review. This review should be completed as soon as possible. If the LGC or the state statutes do not forbid the town from contracting such work, the BOC should direct the audit committee chair to identify and contract with a qualified independent accounting firm for the conduct of a comprehensive internal control review of the town's accounting and finance internal controls, to be overseen by the audit committee. Selection of the firm conducting the internal control review would not be subject to BOC confirmation. C, direct the audit committee to review any financial documentation the chair of the audit committee deems appropriate to enable further review of the financial internal control systems. D, direct the town manager to provide the audit committee with any and all financial documentation requested in association with an assessment of internal control. And lastly, direct the town manager to cooperate fully with the internal control assessment team appointed by the local government commission, or in the event the LGC does not agree to perform the review, with the independent firm selected by the audit committee chair.
It was just handed out as the meeting started, so. Mr. Chairman,
Sir?
she was asking, is there any way the public can get a copy of what you just
I have a
read?
copy right here. Anybody else? I've got my copy and one others. Copies. So I think there's a real question of establishing that, in fact, the board doesn't have the right to bring in an independent review, because all of my research shows that the LGC, the state statute, and the UNC School of Government recommends that we do an internal review. So I don't, town manager has a different position, but, and until that's the case, we're in a bit of a bind time-wise, because the audit year ends June 30th. If we proceed now with hiring a new auditor or selecting an auditor to do it, we'll be done in time to do the internal audit, or the external audit. The internal control review should precede that. That would make the job much easier for the auditor and less expensive for us if we can get a review done, as requested by the LGC and by the external auditor.
Can we just
Yes, sir.
concentrate on one aspect? Let's look at the, at the external audit. Fiscal year ends on June 30th.
Yep.
New one begins. When does the audit of the past fiscal year have to be completed?
By November the 1st, by the last day of October.
Okay.
They have to submit to the LGC their audit, but that has to be done and reviewed with the town and us.
Right, but we have a 5-month window to conduct that audit. And have it
5 months?
Realistically, you should, the board should solicit now to make a selection on the external audit in the next month or so.
That was my next question.
Yes.
How long does the actual process take?
It takes from the end of June through October for
To do
the
the audit.
external auditor
Right.
to do the work. So realistically, you're on target with advertising now for an external auditor.
If we waited later to do that, we might not find an auditor who's not already booked.
Okay.
To the matter of directly contracting with a separate firm, the local government commission requires all auditing contracts to have a statement of work prepared and be approved by the local government commission, regardless of what type of audit it is, internal, external, single point, whatever it is. So the efficacy of the audit chair acting as the direct executive agent to select and contract directly with an internal audit review is probably not appropriate.
I thought the Board of Commissioners had to do the hiring for like-kind services. I didn't know.
They do the hiring, but in our statutes now, we say that the audit chair will recommend, will select the member.
No, it does not.
It actually does, it says it subject to confirmation by the board. So that it selects,
So it's really a recommendation because it needs our approval.
right.
You can call it select.
But the board
it's
doesn't
really
have to go through review, yeah,
recommendation.
exactly. It needs a board approval.
That's for the annual.
That's for the annual
That's
audit.
for the annual audit. Any other type of audit has to be, have a contract approved by the local government commission. Matter of fact, the contract for the annual audit also has to be approved by the local government commission.
Would you like to add, the selection would be to the, subject to confirmation by the board?
Yes.
Given the time, we might need to call a special meeting to do that, but that's okay.
As long as we do it correctly.
And it may fall that with the meeting schedules, that we will get it done in time that a normal board meeting could confirm the selection.
Okay.
But my view was that the audit committee as a group would be the one who reviewed the applicants and selected the person the one they thought was the best offer.
Okay, maybe there's a point in here that's being missed. The statement of work that would be put out for this internal review assessment, that has to be approved by the local government commission.
Understand?
Okay, so if that's what the board desires to do, even though the general statute seems to infer that the local government commission is the daddy rabbit on review of internal processes. That statement of work has to be approved by the local government commission before you can solicit for an internal auditor to come in and do a review.
Can I confirm that last night you informed me that the LGC does those and we're not even allowed to do it?
That's my interpretation, yes. It's 15934 lays out the LGC's responsibilities for assessing internal control processes.
Actually,
I can-
my reading of the legislation says they have the authority to establish what the control should be, but somebody else should do the review. And I don't find it, I haven't gotten any confirmation. That's why I made this dually. If the
I-
LGC does it, then we would have the LGC do it.
I-
If they don't, then we need to do it.
I'd be glad to read the statute for the board's interpretation.
Well, my proposal here takes in both things. If the LGC does it, we're fine. If they don't, then we need to get an internal review established in accordance with the legislation.
Seems to me like we'd need a discussion with our town attorney and guidance on this. I'm strongly concerned about any time the whole board assigns or allows less than the whole board to make such major decisions. That's what you guys,
Just simply make it subject to the review of or confirmation by the board.
I understand that, but the board members as a whole would not have an opportunity to see what you reviewed to get to that recommendation. I'm not going to debate it with you, I just feel like everyone on the board should be involved in something that important. But I'm not going to say any more about it, it's whatever you commissioners want to do.
Have you had a discussion with Noel?
I've given Noel copies of everything and no response back.
Might recommend that, try a phone call to her and get clarification that she agrees with everything before we go forward on something. I think this is one that the town, knowing that the town attorney is in agreement is important.
Well, Noah plans on being here at 10, right?
Yes,
Yeah. So can we kind of hold off and ask the question at 10 or when she
we defer
arrives?
this pending her assessment. That's fine with me. That's fine with me.
Okay, so we're going to suspend discussion on this until later in the meeting. When
Yes,
the
sir.
attorney gets here. So is it my understanding that you want to move on to the budget workshop?
Yes, sir.
Everybody in agreement?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Mr. Hewitt, are you going to lead us through this, or who have you determined?
Ms. Lochner's it.
Good morning.
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 I'm just gonna kind of run through, the slides here, and they're done by fund, so after each fund, if you guys have any questions, I'll be happy, or department heads will be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So, the purpose of this workshop is to explore the revenue streams for the town's 18-19 budget year. And then I'm gonna present the 4 funds, and after each fund, you guys can ask some questions. This is the budget schedule that you guys adopted at the last meeting. Today's the 6th, so next Friday, we will have the expense workshop. Any questions on that? Okay, here are our revenues by fund. The general fund is 110, there's water, sewer, that's 130. Street part is 150, and our canal dredging is 160. We get state revenue distributions each year, and these sources are determined by the state and based on North Carolina's current economic climate. You can see year. They come in quarterly, so we haven't gotten our last, stream of revenue yet. So the numbers that you see on the spreadsheets are based on trend data from previous years and what we had collected thus far. The town-generated revenues that we get are obviously our property tax, our building fees, recycling fees, and then our rents and concessions for the cell towers, the cell tower use that we get on the water tower. This is the budget, this is the formula for which the tax is calculated. You guys can see how that's done without me reading it all the way through, but for the fiscal year 18-19, at the current 22 cents, the estimated revenue would be around 2.6 million. Per Mr. Commissioner Sullivan's guidance, I did calculate what it would be 2 cents less, and you can see it at 2.4. And then at the bottom, you can see the difference in the amounts of the cents and what each penny cost.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
At what point do we start charging taxes on new homes?
I think it's January 1st of the year that like last fiscal year, right? Is that right?
You pick up whatever process it is as of January 1. So if it's not fully complete, then the completed value comes.
The next January.
Not till the next year.
Yeah.
And so this $1,226 million, how much greater is that now than it was a year ago?
I would have to go back and look at last year's.
But has it been increased because of the 60 new homes or
It has been increased a
some
little
new
bit.
homes that were built?
I don't know the exact number has been increased, but it has been
That's good.
increased. And there are, because this is an early workshop, some different
Right.
numbers may come out from the county, and so these are just
Predicting.
initial first numbers that we're seeing. The building fees, based on trends throughout the county, they are moving upward. That's pretty much all that we can say right now. The revenues in this department cannot exceed its expenses, so there's always gonna be a minus there. The recycling fees, you guys have had lots of discussions about this. As of now, about 350 residents are using this curbside recycling. It's roughly about $19,000 as of March. But of course, this might change depending on what the boards decides to do.
Time here. A check on the tax base for your question, John. As of 15 May of 2017, the tax base was estimated $1,208,799,139.
So that's about 18 million increase. That makes sense, yeah.
Is that-
Thank you.
Are you good?
Thank you.
So this, obviously, these amounts might change depending on what you guys consider in your solid waste. Our rents and concessions are simply the water tower, the cell phone usage. They put their antennas up there and they pay to use it. It's very simple, and we get about $100,000 each year from them. Okay, that's Fund 10. So if you guys have any questions on Fund 10 while we're after that short presentation, I'll be happy to answer anything I can.
Is the next step to go into the general fund revenues?
That was the general fund revenues. The next step would be going into the water sewer fund revenues.
Are you gonna go through the spreadsheets or not?
Well, the spreadsheets are pretty self-explanatory. I'm not gonna go line by line because a lot of these numbers are based on trend data right now. We don't have, it's still early, so we don't have a lot of information, so a lot of these numbers will change. So it wouldn't be very lucrative to go through each one, because these numbers will change until June 30th.
I was just trying to figure out why, like for 17,
Is the
18
board going to
budget.
take questions from the floor?
Can I ask a question from the floor, please?
Well, it's up to the commissioners. Do you want to cast it to the public, or do you reserve it for yourself?
I would suggest it's appropriate. This is an open meeting on the budget, so.
Sure. I'm fine.
It's short.
All right, you have it.
I just wondered why, under the first column, FY 17 to 18, why that number is, the same as the proposed budget, why it isn't the one that's in the, monthly budget report that David gives out,
Which line are you talking about?
the second line, that for
The
the.
ad
ad valorem taxes?
The ad valorem taxes.
Yeah.
That was my question. That's why I asked the basis for last year, because if the valuation went up, the tax rate didn't change, I would have expected that to
That
be.
might be a misprint, but the 2658 is correct for this year. So that might have just been a misprint on my part for the 17, 18. But as of now, we've gotten, you can see as of 315, we've gotten 2.5, so it might have just been a misprint.
So that's just a trend number that's in there, because it's the $76,401.
That's
Delta.
correct. That's correct. Based on the amount that we have now from the county, the number that Mr. Fletcher asked about, that is the calculation based on that number, the 2.6 million.
So when will we actually have that number in June, May?
That'd probably be about the last time.
Yeah, probably the end of May.
Yeah.
About the end of
As
May.
things work, they'll send new papers, and probably around May will be, because they'll have to have their numbers for their budget as well.
Yeah.
So probably May will probably be the last time we'll get a new number.
But we don't anticipating it maybe changing. too
Historically, it doesn't radically differ. It's
dramatically. It's not gonna be another
it's
18, million dollars.
de minimis.
It's gonna be, it won't be very much more money, so.
If anything, from what we've seen in the past, it normally goes down in small amounts, sometimes due to the Board of Equalization and Review, newly captured discoveries, but it's pretty close.
Any other questions?
I'd like to point out, better than halfway down on the Blue Can home recycling line, if the board would indulge a discussion on, that's directly related to one of the board's initiatives on what we'll do, and that, this is a revenue workshop. On the expense side, depending on how we end up going or what the time frame is, that number could increase by in order of magnitude of 10. But depending on how they choose to pay for it. Just wanted to point that out. So I guess I'm bringing up the point of there's a number of issues associated with recycling, and what is the time frame that y'all see on us proceeding with some type of recycling effort? There's specific technical, logistical, and administrative issues that have to be resolved in order to implement an island-wide recycling program. Right now, we've left it blank, assuming that we'll continue with the current protocol, but there's a lot of work that's got to be done, and issues contractually, not being the smallest one, that have to come into focus before that program would be able to evolve or permutate from its current structure.
But with the status quo, we would expect at least $20,000, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And as I recall, we had several sort of options out there or thoughts out there about how the recycling program might morph. One of them was, of course, just status quo. One was island-wide and opt-out, as I think of it, that everyone is in and people who don't want to participate opt out. And then the third was keeping it in the, what I say is voluntary sign-up at the beginning of the year, but increase the pickup during seasons so that there would be weekly Saturday recycled pickup during the season. And the question of season is, when does it start in May and running through the end of September? Is that everybody's recollection? And that's what we're going to have to decide on in the near future. Correct, David?
I think
That was your memory, too. And when are you thinking is the appropriate time for us to decide this? At the meeting next week, when we discuss costs, or, what's your timing that you're hoping for?
We'll discuss it any time that the board wants to. There's some issues that have been raised with discussions, not only with the staff and also the provider, that I think as early on as we can register those with the board, that you should include it in your discussions and deliberations on however you would like to proceed. I mean, I can elaborate now if you like.
Why not?
We have time for you to
we do.
elaborate
Okay.
now, so.
Probably regarding recycling at a holistic application, the main concern would be the contractual arrangement, or one of the main concerns would be the contractual arrangement with the provider. And they've verbally raised some concerns about having to front the cost of securing all of the cans up front. And, how would that be handled if people don't participate and they're stuck with the cost of having secured the cans? That's, a very general representation of their concerns, and they have some specific, or voice some specifics like, well, then if we pick them up, where do we store them, those kinds of things. So there's a contractual relationship that the vendor has raised. To the revenue providing or the opting in and people paying for the service, the staff has addressed, well, how will we withhold service, and then if the actual participation rates aren't adequate, what happens when there's not enough funds to provide for the cost? Along with, where do the expenses, which fund did the expenses hit against? So those were some of the things. And then also, we've just renewed the recycling subscriptions in January. If you change the schedule, the participation schedule, and also the actual pickup schedule, how would we handle administratively the billing for those kinds of things? So there's a host of issues that I just wanted to register with the board. So if it's appropriate to defer that discussion to, when we talk about expenses, that's fine. But I just want to at least register that It's not as simple as driving through McDonald's and getting a Big Mac on putting the order in for recycling.
Pertaining to recycling, on the last item that Pat mentioned, would it be possible to get what the additional cost would be for those that are currently recycling, that they would have available to them during the summer months, the recycling every week?
I think that's actually in the solid waste report already.
Is it? I know I got it with me. And
We,
I'm not
we
gonna
went
put
through,
everything
we,
in there.
we went through several options there on what it would be.
Then I'll look it up.
Okay. I just don't recall off the
Yeah, I
top of
don't
my head.
recall it either.
Did the provider indicate in any way they wouldn't be able to manage recycle pickup weekly during season on Saturdays?
Their concern was the voluntary structure of the program, and I was not given the impression that amending the schedule was as problematic as their concern over having to buy $500,000 worth of cans or whatever that cost may be, and then getting stuck with the cost if participation rates weren't up.
Okay.
So, and recycling is done at the individual island-wide basis in other communities and paid for directly by the town in those other communities in various shapes, forms, and fashions, alternate pickup days, that kind of thing.
It was a worthy discussion. Thank you.
So if it's okay, I'm gonna move on to the water and sewer fund. The revenues generated in the water sewer billings and capital sewer charges. Does the revenue that you see in the packet are anticipated to stay the same, but the way that we bill and collect these fees may change due to House Bill 436, which you guys will be discussing and getting a report from the audit committee, and you'll be able to make a decision on how you would like to proceed with that. As of now, just for the purpose of this presentation, this is the current water rate structure. And again, this may change based on House Bill 436. And this is the current rate structure, sewer structure. Rate structure. And because so much of this relies on that, there's really not much more detail to go into, but if you guys would like to ask some questions, and I think Chris might have some comments for the board.
I've got the question, I've just reviewed the study, and it appeared to me it was only about new construction, not changing our existing water rates, the cost that the money we charge for water. Am I correct?
Pretty close, but pretty close, but it technically it's a change in use, not new construction. So the change in use is readily defined as new construction. So most of the people that will be affected by it are new construction.
So my water bill's not going to change.
We don't anticipate any change to the water or the sewer bill or the annual $497.30 assessment that goes out on the tax bill. What we anticipate changing is the rate structure that is directly associated with the line titled share payments in your in your spreadsheet there, it's the third one from the bottom, that we anticipate, unless we've got it horribly wrong, that share payment line will in effect become a new line titled capacity charges. But the amount, that is a sewer amount, capacity charges sewer. That $22,000 that's in the current year's budget is probably an adequate estimate for what we're talking about. There's really only about 100 lots on the island that are subject to that assessment left now. What we also anticipate is a line that's not here that will be capacity charges water, which will be all new construction. A lot of the what's currently titled share payments, many of those lots subject to that fee structure have prepaid, but for water capacity charges, we have no such ordinance in place for the prepayment of capacity charges. So there's probably going to be a significant water rate entry there for the capacity charges. Again, to your point, new construction.
Only for new construction.
Only for new construction.
Existing homeowners don't expect this unless they upgrade the house to a larger bedroom capacity.
That's correct. That, go ahead, Chris, I'm
But
sorry.
also the revenue, like on that, capacity charge for water, you would set that money aside and actually be for capacity.
Future capacity.
Improvements like second water tower, anything that we need in the future. Be part of the financing on that.
Yeah, there's a codicil in the law that says on, and you'll see this on the expense side, that whatever is collected on the revenue side has to be carved out and set aside in a capital reserve fund to be used only for capacity-related expenses.
And you have to have that budgeted, right, in a capital plan?
It'll be in a capital reserve fund.
But don't you also have in the plan, have to have that projection that I'm going to expand capacity, and that's how you base the charge?
The law the capacity charge itself is predicated on those capital facilities that are in a plan or are currently being expensed
Right, yeah.
as a debt instrument. But taking up, I mean, the short version is taking this money up, you have to earmark it by way of a capital reserve fund. So that means we're going to have two extra capital reserve funds, one for water and one for sewer. Okay.
So in effect, you could only spend that money on expanding capacity, not on maintaining the existing capacity.
That's correct. And the sewer lift station upgrade is not a qualifying
Doesn't expand.
expense. We're talking about impact fees. Impact fees.
Can you comment on the fund balance appropriated dropping from $1.5 million down to $84,000 on page 18?
Chris, were you done?
That impact fee too would go away. The impact fee
Okay,
per bedroom fee, I think it's charged per bedroom before, and in all reality, when you think about impact fee and capacity, to me, they both tie hand in hand.
Yeah, and the impact fees will go away.
And also, there's a penalty paid to go along with that share fee on this, that would be there too. So it's actually,
4 or 5 from the bottom on the page 18.
yeah. Yeah, that impact fee on there, or the penalties, that go away. Shows like $45,000 in debt, and it's actually only like, let's say 17 something come in so far. So those penalty pays that you see on that line, that was actually penalties that people had paid it on the unpaid loss or share fee, so those two lines actually tie together. I think, am I losing you?
No, you're right.
Well, I'm just having a hard time with what this means. Our revenues are going to go down by $1.5 million for the year.
Well, I'll
According to
speak to
this.
that. The lion's share of that 1.5 million is represented by the sewer lift station upgrade, which is an appropriation from the water and sewer fund, and we'll have the engineer's expenses paid out of that to some degree for the lift station 4 upgrade. So the lion's share of that will come across and be reappropriated. That's not correct. We'll have to
But
reappropriate that
appropriating it-
money.
But appropriating it is not new revenue.
You're,
Appropriating something's in the fund, identifying that as appropriated is not
but
deriving new income, right?
that's correct. It's not related to any of the fees,
So
fetcher, or
just-
436.
I mean, we would have balanced this fund last year, expenses and revenue, correct?
Yes.
It would have been balanced. And this, obviously, it's falling by $1.5 million. so-
No. I'm saying that the $84,000 that's showing as the projected revenue
Right?
is in error.
Ah,
That we haven't,
You haven't done it yet?
we haven't pulled that over.
Ah, okay.
Yeah,
That's where the bulk of it is.
Yeah.
that's,
right there.
yeah, it's for the lift station upgrade.
Right.
That's what that is. There'll be a corresponding expense, for that. Just understand that the $1.5 million, the 84,000, I believe, represents, the equivalent of a maintenance and repair fund acquisition for new meters, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's my footnote in here actually for myself by doing the expenses that you have to accommodate the expenses and then put it in the fund balance. So that's my just mental note there for me to have to know that you put it in his expenses.
You're gonna have to reappropriate about $1.4 million in order to do the lift station upgrade next year.
Right?
Okay, I got it.
But that's not additional revenue.
You're taking it from your accrued water and sewer revenues, fund balance.
Right.
So it's just an administrative reallocation of funds based on the new law? Is that what we're talking about?
But can we
Where
say
you used to use the 1.5, that's not gonna work, it's gonna come out of the,
It's got nothing at all to do with the House Bill 436. This is an existing program that is basically gonna straddle fiscal years, that we just have to pull the money across. Remember, an expense cannot be made without an appropriation. Okay, and your fund here has a major upfit as an operational expense, and you're not funding that major upfit from your annual revenues. You're funding that from your reserves.
so the difference between the 84,000 and 1.5 is just that you haven't made that funding move yet? Is that-
Yes, because we
Yes.
haven't done the
Okay.
expenses on what we anticipate the lift stations and that to be yet.
Okay.
B part fund.
We good? We good?
The B part, you have a question?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you.
The B part fund is our Fund 50. You guys know a lot about this. As of March 2018, the estimated revenue is 1.7 million. I just want to point out that the grant monies that are listed in the spreadsheet, FEMA, Matthew, Cardiff, and then the fund balance, all those are, not fund balance, Cardiff and FEMA are all anticipated to be collected this fiscal year, so those grant monies will not be available to us next fiscal year. Along with that, you guys have decided to do a capital reserve fund. And here are the points that you guys made at your last budget workshop. You wanted to escrow capital funds until the town's special obligation bond is retired.
That's the central reach,
Yes, well, you guys wanted to do a capital reserve fund for sand.
I understand.
Yeah, so, you said you wanted the monies to be accumulated approximately for 9 years. You wanted a $3 million transfer from the B part fund
Excuse me, did we list what the balance of that is, the central reach bond? The balance?
the
dollar
debt
balance?
service payment. That is in the expense side, but it's like 1.4 something.
We've made one payment, right?
Yes, we just made another payment to the interest part, yes, but we have made.
Joe, I
But-
think your question is that in the very bottom line there, it says fund balance appropriated
Right.
at 123, that number will actually be 3,123,000. Because we'll have to actually spend the money on the expense side to put it into a capital reserve fund. You don't appropriate directly from accrued reserves into a reserve fund. You have to put it into action by an appropriation and then spend it so that it can be tracked. Again, what you're seeing is not the flip side of it that shows the expense to capital reserve for $3 million.
And then the subsequent amounts, you guys want to be sourced from the general fund pending the fund balance reserves reach above 70%. And that's what you guys requested, so we're working on that part. And
I'm sorry, I misspoke. I'm sorry, I misspoke. I said $3,123,500. I was adding the $3 million to the current year's fund balance appropriation. It would actually be the $3,030,000 on the revenue side. You have to appropriate the revenues before you can spend it.
as of March 15th, it was 1.7. I don't know what it is as of right now. It's probably gone up a little bit. But we haven't got a lot of those, because rental season hasn't started yet.
And those revenues aren't collected until the 15th of the month, right? The following of the collection. So that's pretty tight with what we got.
So on the line for FEMA Matthew, we originally put in 6 million of revenue and 6 million of expenses.
Yeah, that whole line's going away.
It's going to go away completely?
Completely
So are you
away.
done
There-
filing
there-
requests?
We have some pending. You want to talk to that?
Yeah, I'll talk about it. Based on our, we've requested a final inspection and turned in our last report because we've checked with the engineer. We think all the invoices we can capture, we've done. It looks like we're going to get to about $3,025,000 on the sand side, or category G. And then I think David had given you a spreadsheet with the other breakdown for the rest of the funds, but, that's what it looks like. It's about, that 174 is what we're waiting
The last
on.
invoices?
Yeah, and, they will have to clear us for that final inspection, but we feel like it'll come in before the end of this budget year, as well as what we were waiting on for our end, that was part of the project.
Thank you.
But there's no need to roll that grant forward because all on the expense side we're Winchestered on that.
What was the number, Kristen? Three?
$3,025,000 is what it looks like, it's going to be on the category G part, and, I I think based on that spreadsheet he gave you, it was about 86 total thousand that we first got back in last fiscal year from Matthew in the 16-17 fiscal year that was Fund 10.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
The canal dredging fund, they met, I guess it was last week or so, and they decided to keep their assessments the same for next fiscal year, so the information you see is correct. As in the current estimate, or as of today, not what will be in the budget. The only thing that is not in there are the grant monies that they're gonna receive, because we have to put a special line in there to show the revenue for each of those. I have that information if you're interested in it. Go ahead.
And Mandy is correct, because she sat in on those meetings, and they did agree to keep their assessments the same, but as of yesterday, we received word from our engineer, we had let them know this ahead of time that this could occur, but the Corps has denied us using the full areas 290 and 292, so that means we're gonna have to create our own dredge pool area on town property that we might own. And that means that when we meet with them again, that could change. They could change what they decide that they want to do with their assessments. So just to make you guys aware, that's brand new information. Maybe you didn't even know that, because I got the email this morning and the information from David yesterday.
Can I continue, or do I need to wait?
If I could point out one thing back to the B-part funds, in the line item that also goes away is the FEMA Irene line item on that, in that revenue too.
No, that concludes my presentation. If you guys have any more questions, I will be happy to sit down.
What's it?
Mr. Wright, do you have slides? Do you need this too, maybe? Okay.
I would like to go ahead and give the board a heads up. Christie alluded to the fact that we've got we're gonna have to engage with the Corps of Engineers on the use of the town-owned facilities for disposal of dredge materials from the canal subdivisions. That is going to require some engineering and technical solutions, logistical. It may require some political intervention too. But we're gonna work on that at the staff level. If it does arise to the level that it requires board involvement, intervention, we'll come back to you on that. Just like to register with you that the canal subdivision dredging project it's in a lot better shape and has worked a lot better over the course of the last 10 years with the help and facilitation of the volunteer working group in inputting into our master plan for the canal dredging. They've just been really good to work with, but it has the potential to affect twice as many homes as the Central Reach project did. There's 50,000 linear feet of property owned, approximately 50,000 linear feet of canal frontage in our 3 subdivisions. That's about 1,000 lots, 50-foot lots, if you want to do that kind of math. For the Central Reach project, it's about 500 lots, maybe not that many. So the potential for getting it wrong probably has a greater impact to the number of property owners than the Central Reach project. So it's important, and I know that the commissioners, it's been working well and hasn't had to have commissioner involvement at all. It's run on its own, I think is one of the quotes. So we've got this pegged as a priority project and want to make sure that it gets done right, because we certainly don't want to replicate some of the faux pas that occurred in history. I'm good. I'm done.
All right, what's the pleasure of the board? Do you want to go back to number 2, or do you want to?
I've
do
actually,
Number 3.
I gave my comment to the town attorney. She would like us to wait till the evening to get her response. She'd like to do her investigation before she gives any comments.
Be able to answer a question.
All right. Are we ready for Mr. Clark Wright?
Yes, sir?
Are we ready? Floor is yours, Mr. Wright.
If you want to take a short break, I got a bunch of notebooks to haul in and give to each of you.
Take a 10-minute recess?
Sounds good.
Sure, 5-minute recess?
5 minutes?
5 minutes.
You good to go?
Yes,
Mr.
sir.
Mayor? All right. As some of you know, my name is Clark Wright with the law firm of Davis, Hartman Wright out of Newbern. My specialties are environmental law and related regulatory issues. And pursuant to a December 2017 resolution, I was retained by the town as outside special environmental counsel to advise on coastal shoreline protection issues generally, but more specifically the Terminal Groin project, which of course was coming to a head in terms of the federal process. I have copies of a report that I have done, a written report that is confidential attorney-client privileged information. I'll hand those to y'all individually. If you would please not distribute or copy or talk about with others without talking to either Noel or myself, that would be greatly appreciated. The next thing I'd like to do is sort of continued housekeeping. I and my office, which basically means me and Peggy Garvick, my paralegal, have prepared some notebooks for you. I'm asking Noel to take a quick look at them. I believe everything in there is either public record or non-confidential, but before, she'll have a chance maybe between now and this evening to take a further look and make sure I'm right on that. And I'll go through a few highlights from this rather big document. Before I do that, I've already got a couple of additional items for you to go in there. Peggy missed slip sheeting some pages in the tab that deals with minutes of your own meetings. Obviously, you're aware of those, but so everybody has the same thing. This should be added to the tab, which is, I think, number 7, that deal with Board of Commissioners minutes. And there's a one-pager in there dealing with the December 19th meeting, but
but it only had the one page and did not have these 2 pages, which were the actual discussion of hiring me. So you may want to add that to your notebooks if and when you have a chance. Yeah. Thank you. Good point. And the report, yeah, that's why I had a couple left over. Keep me straight.
I'll make sure that Peter gets this.
All right. One more item in my document, I referred to a provision in the North Carolina Constitution. And so here's a slip sheet on that. Put that in the tab that's got statutes and laws. As I hand this out, I'll talk a little too. This handout, the North Carolina Constitution is really unique. I think this first paragraph of Article 15, Section 5, Article 14, Section 5 is worth taking a quick look at. It has been cited with approval on several occasions by our courts.
Just go to section 5.
And I actually think it's worth a read. It shall be the policy of this state to conserve and protect its lands and waters for the benefit of all its citizenry. And to this end, it shall be a proper function of the state of North Carolina and its political subdivisions to acquire and preserve park, recreational, and scenic areas, to control and limit pollution of our air and water, control excessive noise, and in every other appropriate way to preserve as part of the common heritage of this state its forests, wetlands, estuaries, beaches, historical sites, open lands, and places of beauty. And, you know, that's really what we're all about here. And that issue is perceived differently by different folks. I think everyone would support and agree with the basic principles that are in this constitutional provision, and the tough nut to crack is how you get there when you're dealing with specific situations. The other little slip-sheeted item I gave you is Article 1, Section 32, exclusive emoluments. Very short and sweet. No person or set of persons is entitled to exclusive or separate emoluments, which means goodies, to put it in layman's terms, or privileges from the community, but in consideration of public services. And basically, translated into even simpler English, that means no governmental entity can spend public funds to accomplish protection of what are essentially private property issues. Again, a gray area that comes into play almost every time a town, a county, or state, engages in road building or projects like this. It takes a lot to actually trigger a violation of this clause. Both of these I put in your materials just more as background information, not as any specific legal theory or liability relative to the proposed terminal groin project. I also, David, and I would like to really publicly thank David Hewitt, town manager, and Heather for all that they put up with me asking for all kinds of information and documents. They were a huge help. And one of the items David gave me, which I think was real smart of him to think about, that some of you may have overlooked because land use plans sometimes get put together and then stuck in a notebook like this and then collect dust in the corner. But This is one more handout of 2 relevant pages from the town's approved CAMA land use plan, which is in essence integrated into the CAMA permitting process. The land use plan itself is often a collection of policies, which a policy is not directly enforceable, but it does set out, if you will, the big picture thoughts and desires and goals of the community as it relates to development activities that are covered by the CAMA permitting process. Let me check one more to make sure. All right. So, turning to the nitty-gritty, a lot of what the Board of Commissioners has asked me to give input on is, I think, confidential attorney-client communication, possibly related to potential litigation matters. And so I think we'll probably have a significant portion of our discussions this morning, and maybe even a bit this evening, in closed session. And I will try to walk the appropriate fine line with what I say here relative to that. The big picture for terminal groins in the state of North Carolina, you may or may not be familiar with, sort of begins in 1974 with the enactment by the General Assembly of a fairly, at the time, radical and revolutionary law, Coastal Area Management Act, or CAMA for short. And so CAMA's now been with us for 74, 80, 44 years. During almost all of that 44-year time period, one of the cornerstones of CAMA was the regulation of so-called development activities within so-called areas of environmental concern. And from the beginning, one of the key areas of environmental concern is the ocean front, which I believe is referred to as the ocean hazard area. There's a hint right there. CAMA essentially prohibited so-called hardened structure development within the state's ocean beaches, which were, at that point, assumed to be public and available to everyone to recreate on and use, even if it was part of a, delineated, plotted private property lot. The North Carolina Supreme Court, probably all of you have heard of the famous or infamous Nye case, recently resoundingly reaffirmed those principles. And basically, for possible relevance to what we're talking about, the point is that even if a private property owner owns to the water line, or even in some cases out well into the Atlantic Ocean for older platted lots, it's subject to a right of use by the general public to recreate and carry on, if you will, normal beach type activities. A very interesting issue, and it's, I believe, the last tab in your notebooks, is some sections from Chapter 146 of the North Carolina General Statutes. 146 deals with issues related to the state's ownership or rights in so-called vacant and unappropriated lands. And interestingly, that category includes everywhere that a renourishment project has raised land from where prior to the project it was submerged or below the mean high water mark. And the Central Reach project's an example where Noel Fox had to deal with a flood of literally hundreds of those easements, which is the right way to do it. A number of renourishment projects, I think, have taken place without that level of legal formality. But it really is important to recognize that as a matter of law, any lands that were covered with waters of the ocean, but after the renourishment project are, quote, dry sand or dry, upland portions of the ocean beaches, those belong to the state of North Carolina. And literally, by law, the state has title to those areas. It's my personal opinion that that is becoming a more and more, quote, interesting, in the Chinese proverb sense of the term, issue, and a potentially complex and troubling issue because, as we all know, Mother Nature can pretty strongly alter that shoreline at her whim, especially during storm events. And so you can have an area that has been eroded more gradually over time, that then you have a renourishment project, whether it's the Central Reach or some of the East End or just dredging Lockwood's Folly Inlet and depositing sand, where then there are actually portions of that beach that the state has a technical, statutory, legal title to, and then the next storm comes along and erodes it back to where it was before or even further inland, and suddenly the state doesn't have any title anymore. And needless to say, there's not anybody up there in Raleigh keeping real good track of this. But because of technology, we now have the ability to do just that by comparing aerial photographs, which of course is something that CAMA, Division of Coastal Management, pursuant to CAMA, does a whole bunch of for various purposes, whether it's to establish, setbacks, first line of stable natural vegetation, the limits of the various areas of environmental concern jurisdiction, and many other things. I think that as we look at these terminal groin projects, that's an issue that maybe needs a little more attention than it's gotten to date by state and federal regulators. Even the Division of Coastal Management is not very focused on that. They got plenty else on their plate. But it's a potential fundamental concern if the place where a groin structure or anything else that's a potential exception to the general prohibition on development structures within the ocean beaches, wherever it comes ashore, it's possible that one would need a formal application and approval from, it's under the Department of Administration's State Property Office, and also an entity called the Council of State, in order to authorize the placement of the groin structure on top of any portions of beach areas that were, quote, dry land now because of prior renourishment projects. And needless to say, there's not a word about that in this FEIS or probably any others, but I think it is a very real issue. And I guess I'm sensitized to that a little bit by the fact that I served in the North Carolina Attorney General's office and dealt with some of the early legal disputes involving that issue. Turning to the federal process, just in terms of process, I guess the short elevator speech version of it is, the town has expended close to $650,000 over the past 7 years seeking a permit for a terminal groin. And that process has ground along at, even by government standards, a painfully slow pace, where you have initial enactment of the terminal groin legislation in 2011, and then the town formally interacting with the Corps and retaining Dow, Cordy and Associates and ATM and others starting back in 2012. And here we are in the spring of 2018, 6 years later, with the notice and publication of the final environmental impact statement on March 15th. Another sort of federal nuance. It was signed on the 8th, but not formally published until the 15th, because that's when it got in the next cycle of the Federal Register, or nowadays, I guess it's more the digital Federal Register. But it's obvious that one of the significant reasons that the board retained me and my hopefully professional legal expertise was because of concerns about whether the town wants to continue forward with that project or not. And because that's sort of the background of why I was retained, this confidential report sort of reads more negatively maybe than some of the other documents I've written. In other words, it has focused on potential legal concerns and flaws and other ambiguities in primarily the federal process, but also to a lesser extent the state process. Again, one of the reasons I think the history of CAMA is important is because I think it will color the way any court will view any potential litigation. In other words, you have a long period of time, sort of like where the board is in reverse, where the state went in one direction with prohibitions on such structures and lots of studies and policy documents that talk about potential problems and reasons why that policy makes sense. But then you now have the legislature trying to respond to very legitimate concerns by local governments like Holden Beach and other communities, public and private, along the barrier islands to the threats of increased erosion and threats of damage to literally millions of dollars of property. And in response to that, in 2011, you had the first terminal groin legislation, which expressly amended a portion of the CAMA statute that I think more people than they would like can recite to the number by heart, 113A-115.1, the so-called terminal groin legislation. It's worth making a note at this juncture on that the way the way laws become laws works in North Carolina, sort of Civics 101, is similar to other states in the federal government, but not every law is codified, strangely enough. There are thousands of so-called session laws that are valid laws of the state of North Carolina, enforceable, but they're not part of the numbered and indexed general statutes. So the heart of the terminal groin legislation is codified in 113A-115.1, which is part of CAMA. But all of the other provisions in all of those session laws, many of which are in your materials, are also the law. And in that regard, again, there is an inherent legal conundrum and sort of new issues of ambiguity or potential conflict between this new provision, which lays out in a bunch of detail a brand new process relative to 40 years of CAMA, both in terms of the other provisions in the CAMA statute and in case law. A good way to sort of think about that in a way that matters is to posit this simple question. Does the Senate bill that resulted in codification of 113A, 115.1 merely allow the Division of Coastal Management to issue CAMA permits? Or on the other hand, is it essentially a mandatory instruction to the division that if you do A, B, C, and D, you will be issued a permit. And there are places in that statute where you can go read and make an argument either way. And there are also a number of provisions in that statute that expressly refer to this as a pilot program, i.e. a sort of experimental program. And then you have the fact that in 2011, you had some very high hurdle financial responsibility requirements codified into law that 2 years later get repealed. And the reason that's relevant is again, they're both part of the legal history here. And one in particular that I think is potentially troubling is the original statute had a financial responsibility requirement that local governments and other potential applicants rightly said, how in the world can we meet this, where basically it required the permit applicant to indemnify broadly, you know, any potential damages should they be measured in the monitoring that was going to have to be paid for by that applicant. So they're sort of saying, hey, you're going to build the case for somebody to take litigation action against you. And I think the legislature certainly heard versions of that outcry about that conundrum back, and so the provision was struck. But striking the provision from the financial responsibility portions of the legislation raises a rather obvious question. If it was enough of a concern for the General Assembly to put it in there in the first place, is that a real concern? And bringing that around to this particular project, the question would be, even if you get the federal permits, even if you get the state CAMA permits, are there potentially various private property rights causes of action that could potentially come into play where the plaintiff would literally, as the first paragraphs in their complaint, cite to the state law itself. I think that in terms of the NEPA documentation, I'm reminded, obviously I've heard probably thousands of lawyer jokes over the 34 years I've been practicing, but I've only got one good engineering joke, and it's too long-winded to tell here, but I'm reminded when I read Corps of Engineers documents and other supporting engineering documents of the old adage that if you're a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. And engineers, quite rightly, in many cases, believe that an engineered solution is going to take care of your problems. And I think, again, the great dilemma when it comes to the dynamic ocean beaches shoreline is when, bless you, under what circumstances is that, quote, true or accurate or a positive thing with regard to structures like terminal groins versus the opposite. And a very important point that I think is terribly under-recognized in this FEIS is there's no way to conduct a traditional science study with controls and double blinds or other typical scientific method techniques to prove or disprove that point. Because you can't do it one way, watch it for 20 years, and then get in the time tunnel. I'm so old, I remember that crazy show on TV, and go back and not do it and see how things turn out that go round, where the only variable that's changed is the presence or absence of a hardened structure like a terminal groin or a jetty. Instead, you have to look at the best available evidence and make hopefully scientifically valid assumptions and hypotheses about the extent to which that particular element of a shoreline protection plan is helping or hurting. And I guess the simple statement would be that the, quote, jury is still out on that. I personally am influenced by the fact that when I served as Governor Jim Martin's Special Environmental Counsel on offshore drilling, I got to meet many of the state and nation's coastal processes experts. And not all of them, but the vast majority of them express concerns over the potential impacts of hardened structures on soft shorelines that are so dynamic. And whether there's two issues. One, whether they accomplish the intended goal, and or B, do they cause other unintended adverse consequences. And again, better to refer to the codified statute, the CAMA provision, 113A, 115.1, in a sense expressly recognizes that, because it's coupled with still some significant financial responsibility requirements, some non-trivial monitoring and data collection requirements that extend pretty broadly both geographically and temporally in terms of the number of years that data has to be gathered. And not necessarily pejoratively saying this, but you are a guinea pig if you do one of these, because you couldn't do them for 40 years, and you're part of this pilot project, and you're collecting data, and we don't know what the results will be. I think people rightly turn to, well, where do we have existing hardened structures in North Carolina already? And the two that get the most discussion there are the groin/mini jetty that was constructed at Pea Island, next to, on the, quote, south side of Oregon Inlet, and then the Fort Macon groin structure, which in various forms or fashion has been there since, just to use a round number, the 1970s. The difficulty with both of those examples is the same thing that's also a benefit in the proposed terminal groin project here, and that is that it is coupled with extensive beach renourishment. And also, both of those situations are excellent examples of the third variable, which has never gotten the amount of attention it deserves, and that is dredging efforts in the channel of that inlet, both in terms of frequency, depth, width, and very importantly, alignment. It may be a little bit counterintuitive, but as a general rule, if the inlet channel is slanted a little bit towards, quote, your shoreline, that tends to trigger accretion. If it's slanted towards the other side of the inlet shoreline, that tends to trigger heightened erosion. And I think there's a fair consensus among the various scientists and engineers who've looked at Lockwood's Folly Inlet, or Lockwoods, depending on which map you look at. And I can't help it, I'm an insanely curious person. I went to a very interesting website to try to figure out the history of that name, and the answer is there's about 5 or 6 different stories. You pick the one you like. It's like, what are the origins of the term Tar Heel? 5 or 6 stories about that. But anyhow, getting back to the point there, the east end of Holden Beach has experienced serious erosion problems, primarily during the oscillation, if you will, of the channel, where it is closer to the shoreline of Oak Island than to Holden Beach, and vice versa. When its alignment is more to the west, towards the east end of Holden Beach, the area experiences either much less erosion or even temporary periods of accretion. And more recently, the combination of some movement of that channel combined with renourishment, combined with no direct hits from big hurricanes or nor'easters, the east end's actually in pretty decent shape right now. I think in the last conversation I had with Mayor Holden, he rightly pointed out, don't let that fool you. And amen to that. All you have to do is look at some of the aerial photography to understand that. There are situations, in fact, right there at the west end of Holden Beach. Matter, I was up here in front of some of y'all before on a variance request for Mr. Gribben, you know, who was concerned that his boardwalk ended a long darn way from where he could get to the beach. Well, a storm event or two suddenly took care of about 300 feet there. Just poof, disappears overnight. Turning back to the channel point, a really important issue is the southern beaches in North Carolina are generally considered sand-starved with mostly hard bottom, so you have less there to soften the impacts than you do in some areas of the northern half of the state. And when you look at the various dredging operations, whether they be done privately or by the Corps, turning back, say, to Beaufort Inlet, that channel was widened and deepened, and the Corps views that sand as a waste product or as a byproduct. Like, how do we get rid of this? And in the case of Fort Macon, there's literally been, I think, over 1 million cubic yards of sand dumped offshore. If sand could be easily transported in large quantities, obviously that's a stupid thing, but sand is not easy to transport in large quantities, and the amounts you need to re-nourish even 1,000 linear feet of beach is a pretty big number and requires some pretty big pipelines or pumps or hoppers or barges or dump trucks, you name your transport vehicle of choice. It's expensive and not easy to do. In trying to feed from many fire hoses to get up to speed on a lot of these issues, I've had some extended conversations with Rudy Rudolph. Some of you may know that name and many may not. Well, Carteret County was farsighted enough to sort of appoint somebody to head up their shoreline protection program a long time ago, and they got a good one. And Rudy has been dealing with these issues for a long time. Regardless of how the board decides on this particular issue, I would encourage you to invite him to come and speak to you and to the public, and I think Rudy would be willing to do that. Sort of similar to, you know, I reached out to Spencer Rogers, another fellow who's been involved in these issues for a long time relative to North Carolina, and I think Spencer is coming tonight to talk again more generally, not specifically, quote, pro or con on this project. And I think if I can sum up what both Rudy and Spencer would say in one sentence, it would be terminal groins, if properly designed and sited, can work to trap sand and potentially have minimal negative adverse environmental consequences, semicolon. But as to whether it makes sense economically, that's a whole nother ball of wax. And I think that's kind of where we are, if I would put it in one sentence. I think that the other thing that I think I'd talk about a little bit generically, publicly, is the most imminent final agency decision is, of course, the record of decision, which could issue from the Corps of Engineers as early as April the 17th, which led to a very legitimate concern that I and the board had with regards to whether or not we needed to ask the Corps for an extension of time in order to not be foreclosed from the full range of options when the board next meets in its regularly scheduled April 17th session. I want to talk about this in more detail in closed session, but suffice it to reference a very public document, the Ocean Isle Terminal Groin permitting process. In the case of the Ocean Isle Terminal Groin, the final environmental impact statement was issued, and it took 9.5 months for the Corps to write and sign and publish the final record of decision. Another fine example of government blazing efficiency in action. Maybe I shouldn't say that because obviously the record of decision document is a very important document, both legally and pragmatically. It's the summation of the rationale for picking the alternative that is being permitted, and it is actually contains the permit decisions as well. And those two permits are Section 10 permits under the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899, an oldie, and Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, which is more commonly argued over and litigated when it comes to wetlands issues in various development scenarios or enforcement scenarios. But Section 10, so basically Section 10 applies, and this is a gross oversimplification, below the mean high water mark, and Section 404 applies above the mean high water mark. It's not nearly that simple, but that's close enough for government work for our purposes. The distinction could have significant legal consequences. Section 404 of the Clean Water Act the Clean Water Act is a very involved piece of federal legislation, and it contains a rather unique section, which is Section 505. And Section 505 is the citizen suit provisions, which allow various people who can establish standing to file suit in federal court against the Corps. And
I'm sorry, we probably lost communications with the generator firing up. If you
Okay.
wouldn't mind making sure that the clerk, we got it, okay.
we're good. Anyhow, the Clean Water Act, Section 404, actually has a specific provision in it allowing so-called private attorneys general to sue to enforce the statute as they see it against EPA and the Corps and the holder of any 404 permits issued by EPA and or the Corps. EPA is actually the primary final authority on Section 404 permits, but has delegated most of that authority to the Corps. Similarly, you got the Coastal Resources Commission as the final authority on CAMA, but they've delegated to the Division of Coastal Management most of the permitting process. I mentioned that because in my career, I have come to know and both love and hate a number of the attorneys who work for the Southern Environmental Law Center. And SELC, for short, has been a very effective litigator in federal courts, often under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, and in appropriate cases using 505 as one of their legal theories. The importance of that observation is that if you win under 505, you can petition for costs and attorney's fees. And literally a substantial portion of SELC's financial balance sheet consists of their winnings on their petitions for attorney's fees in cases they win, which not only usually serve to expand federal law jurisdiction, but then help fund the next fight. It's a rather interesting scenario. SELC, as I think most of us know, has already initiated federal court litigation challenging the Corps' permitting decisions on the terminal groin Section 10 and 404 permits for the east end of Charlotte Inlet. Interestingly, the west end of Holden Beach, a good portion of it is within the monitoring study area for that terminal groin. And that is another big picture issue. If you want to know why groups like SELC are just so fired up against any of these structures, it's because they fear the domino effect, which if you look at, for instance, the aerial photographs in Dr. Pietrafesa's white paper of the scalloped shoreline of New Jersey, groin, scallop, groin, scallop. And the concern is that it's a domino effect. If one groin is, it's almost this simple. If it's working, then it's stealing sand that would be going somewhere else. And if it's stealing sand out of the system that would be going somewhere else, then wherever else it would be going is potentially being adversely impacted. Now, the idea behind groins is, hey, we think we've engineered a sweet spot. I think David's used that term, and it's a good one. You know, with a groin, you try to make it porous enough to where it's not stealing all of it, and low enough to where during storm events, sand can go over it, and short enough to where sand can still get around it, but still long enough and thick enough to capture sand and hold the fillet, and that's the term used for the area that's engineered to be, you know, increased, if you will, in terms of the beach. And then after that, kind of wash on by or pass on by. That's the sort of engineering principles there in a nutshell. And the other interesting thing from an engineering point of view, which I think is important for everyone, including the public, to realize is, you know, generally the sand transport system is from, if you will, north to south, or in Holden Beach's case, from east to west. But at every inlet, there are significant flows the other way. It's sort of like eddies in a river. You know, if you do any whitewater paddling, yeah, the river's going this way, but there are places where you can flip around and go back upstream behind an eddy, sometimes for significant lengths. And similarly, while the inlet is part of a macro sand transport mechanism that does run from east to west, there's a very clear back eddy portion where the currents are flowing the other direction, and that's what this groin is intended to intercept. And so that's the design concept behind terminal groins that are located, if you will, on the downdrift side of inlets relative to the big picture sand transport process. Because of their porous nature and low-lying height above sea level, most engineers will admit that terminal groins are not going to either really stabilize an inlet that is migrating or help protect a channel from the need for dredging. And obviously the shallow draft channel in Lockwood Folly Inlet has needed constant dredging for a very, very long time, which cuts both ways. On the one hand, it's a ready source of a certain amount of very compatible sand material for the east end, but on the other hand, it is a significant expense and barrier to recreational and commercial fishermen trying to get in and out of there. I think something that both Alan and David have rightly expressed, not just to me, but to all of you and publicly, is it's a new day out there, and don't be counting on, I think David used the term once, manna from heaven coming from Washington, D.C., you know, much longer. Whether it's this project or bigger picture projects, even keeping the Intracoastal Waterway open there, because to the core, if they're back there behind the barrier island, keeping the Intracoastal Waterway open, it's gonna cost them a good bit more to actually have that sand put on the beach here at Holden on the east end. It certainly can be done, and I think it's something that should definitely be looked at long and hard, and already is being by David. You know, you want to lobby to get as much of those sand sources as you can, and if you have some funding to maybe convince the Corps to bring it further. Problem there is that when you dredge in there, in the waterway, you're generally using a shallower draft dredge setup that's not very well suited for piping sand a long way. And if you're out in the ocean, well, then you're not getting that sand. And that leads to another area that, again, just big picture, I think is very underappreciated, and that's the infrastructure that is associated with dredging. You know, there's only a few dredge vessels and setups available at any one time, and the Corps has to sort of pick among projects as to which one gets contracted next with which piece of equipment. And the pieces of equipment, the ocean-going bigger dredge setups can't go in the shallower portions of the inlet, and vice versa. A lot of the shallower dredge setups literally are not even authorized as ocean-going dredge machinery. And that is another piece of this puzzle that is relevant to the town's struggle, which will be infinite and, you know, will exist as long as the town's around to manage and deal with shoreline protection and shoreline erosion. With regard to the specifics in my paper, I think I would recommend to the board and the town attorney that we go into closed session for me to deal further with that. But I'm happy to answer any particular questions if there are areas that the board would like me to touch on before we do that. I guess one other thing I should say is in the last 24 hours, I have received strong letters of objection to the project from Professor Andy Coburn of the Shoreline Program up there at Western Carolina, which strangely enough started out at Duke and migrated west instead of east. Don't understand that fully. And from Jeff Gisler, a senior attorney for the Southern Environmental Law Center, and from a new entity that appears to be a collection of property owners, some of whom I think are even at the East End, who are opposed to the project. Those came in at the last minute, but I think that they are all in your materials.
What's the pleasure of the board?
Can I ask a question? Clark, you mentioned groins at Fort Macon and Pea Island. Would you comment or I think that I'm wanting you to point out their proximity to the port at Morehead City and also the Bonner Bridge and Oregon Inlet?
Absolutely, and that's a good point, David. That's the bigger point is every one of these inlet situations is really unique. You know, there's some lessons you might be able to learn one way or the other, but both the Beaufort Inlet, the reason the Beaufort Inlet has been deepened and widened, and another important variable, extended further out to sea with the deep water channel, is because Morehead City Port is a significant commercial operation that has seen some significant growth. In fact, I'm, in a small way, personally responsible for that. Our firm long ago was part of a brownfields type project to get some new wood chipping activity going there at the port and to expand the port's capacity. And so, yeah, in response, the channel has been widened, deepened, and extended further out. And much of that sand that was removed from the system did not get put on the beaches, but a lot of it did. You've had very extensive renourishment, I think over 500,000 cubic yards total over the past decade or two, put on the beaches there right around Atlantic Beach and Fort Macon. And then at Pea Island, the history there goes way back. When I was in the Department of Justice, we were arguing with the feds and the environmental groups over jetties for Oregon Inlet because of the commercial importance to a lot of commercial fishermen there. And you got the Wanchese Seafood Park and a lot of growth in recreational boating as well. And that inlet, unlike, and this is, I think, David, another important distinction, that inlet absolutely is migrating south, or wants to. The Lockwood Folly Inlet, at least for the past 70-plus years, is more of an oscillating inlet that sort of moves to the left and moves to the right over an old riverbed that has a deep channel in the throat, sort of, quote, naturally, and is not perceived from the available data to be marching, towards the east end of Holden Beach, other than these oscillations, which again, ironically, when it comes closer to us, tends to help the east end, and when it moves further away, tends to hurt in terms of erosion pictures, and that's definitely different. And obviously, Oregon Inlet is much, much bigger, and you've got the Bonner Bridge is a huge piece of infrastructure to protect. Unfortunately, there is another analogy there, and that is SELC. They sued over some of the proposals up there regarding the bridge and were successful in federal court on challenging the environmental documentation associated with one of the Bonner Bridge proposals. And I think later everyone got together and worked out a compromise. The other unique thing up there that you don't have pretty much anywhere else is you got the national seashores as part of the equation. But similarly, Fort Macon, you had protection of a state park resource as an issue as well. I think if you look at what the coastal scientists that are opposed to these hardened structures would point to, they would point you to what was done with the lighthouse and say that instead of hardening, what you're better off doing is retreating. Now, that's easy for them to say in the ivory tower of an academic institution. It ain't so easy when it's your home or your town or your infrastructure.
And a point I'd like to make for the commissioners relating to navigation channels in the shallow draft inlet permit that the town currently holds. It's noted that the authorized depth in the Lockwood Folly Inlet is 12 feet plus 2, and that if it wasn't the Secretary of the Army, it was the division chief. I stand to be corrected on the source, but a decision was made in the 60s not to dredge the Lockwood Folly Inlet to full depth and to maintain that inlet at 8 feet based on the type of equipment available to maintain beyond the coal regs line. So that's a seemingly dissimilar related fact, but it does play into the least cost method of disposal
Absolutely,
equation
David.
that we deal
and
with.
It plays into, yeah, even just basically the amount of sand you're going to have available too. And ironically, it sort of also plays into the frequency with which you got to do it. Because, in fact, SD5, that stands for shallow draft. And yeah, and of course, the other point, David, that I think you've made too is, on top of that, because it's a shallow draft with that kind of equipment, in the big 800-pound gorilla's eyes, it's a lower priority. You know, they might be willing to do that wedge shape that's part of the Intracoastal Waterway itself, but, you know, the actual exit to the ocean, that's getting lower and lower on the Corps' priority list with each passing year. A number, and I can't tell you what great rational order all these materials are in your notebook, but one of the things I've tried to do is put in there some bigger picture pieces of information. You know, I think while it's a slow process and it sure as heck has not been properly funded, I think there is a growing recognition by the state, the General Assembly, many counties, and many local municipalities that we're going to have to coordinate and find a way to fend for ourselves and not count on the Corps and money from DC more and more as the future unfolds. And I think if I was going to leave the board with one simple lesson, that would be it, that no matter what decision is made about a particular pile of rocks or not, the need to coordinate and interact with fellow local governments, the county and the state, and maybe even some of these environmental groups, depending, to find ways to efficiently come up with the dollars and coordinate shoreline protection, which a lot of is going to be beach renourishment under any scenario, is critical. And on that, I would like to specifically mention to you, again, Rudy, and in a sense, this is an important juxtaposition, at least in my mind. As we sat here waiting and waiting for this final EIS to come out, you know, I would check the Corps' major projects website in the Wilmington district, and, you know, nothing would be there, nothing would be there. And I'm also on their sunshine list where I get little blips for the public notices that come out, nothing. And then blip, up comes the FEIS notice for the Bogue Banks 50-year master renourishment project. And that's, in some respects, Rudy's baby. That is part of a long-term coordinated effort to get a master renourishment plan together for that whole set of communities that I kind of call collectively Emerald Isle, probably the great dismay of Atlantic Beach and Pine Knoll Shores and others. But that's quite an accomplishment. And interestingly, that FEIS was published on March the 1st, and well, the third-party preparer was Dial Cordy. The permit agency was the Corps, and yet in that document, and there's a lot of different reasons why, the terminal groin alternative was rejected in favor of a coordinated renourishment alternative only. And the point there is not that that means that was right and this one was wrong, or this one's right and that one was wrong. Each situation is unique. One of the big challenges that you in Holden Beach face is you're a small barrier island. And what I mean by that is just in terms of geography and topography, it was a lot easier for Emerald Isle and Pine Knoll Shores and Atlantic Beach to work together because they're not separated by inlets between them. They're all part of one bigger barrier island where a coordinated management scheme was just simply topographically easier. It's going to be harder for communities like Oak Island and Holden Beach and Ocean Isle Beach and so on to coordinate, because they've got to deal with multiple inlets as part of any effort to try to coordinate strategy-wise, and each of those inlets has different channels and priorities and involvement of the Corps and whatnot. But I think it's critical that those kind of bigger picture cooperative efforts be a big part of the board's agenda and focus long-term. And I think, you know, the state's done some things that at least on paper look pretty good there. Well, they've set up at least the structure for that fund. Now, they just put some money in it. And, you know, you got the beach and inlet management programs and the like. But, again, if there's one real lesson there, it's, yes, Holden's got to fend for itself as best it can, but these issues of shoreline erosion don't respect political boundaries, and and there are inherent advantages in trying to coordinate on these bigger picture 50-year plans. And I think a challenge there that may not be fully appreciated yet is that the Corps is used to doing things the Corps' way. That's for darn sure. And they're used to their big projects, and they have their way of looking at economics and their way of looking at cost benefit. And when they are not the primary funder, but still the permitting agency, I'm worried that there's going to be a danger, and already have seen some examples of this, where they are applying their big picture sort of clunky analysis to situations where more of the funding and more of the purpose and need are defined differently than they might. And they're going to have to find ways to be more flexible in dealing with communities and groups of communities that come to them with coordinated shoreline protection proposals that need their blessing, their stamp of approval. Because you still need their approval with even, you know, whether it's with or without a groin. That's the Bogue Banks final EIS is a good example of that. But I thought that was important enough to put some materials in your notebook regarding that proposal, and there's also materials in there. I put in your materials the full copy of the Ocean Isle Beach record of decision, because if you want something, the closest thing to look at as to what a final record of decision in your situation would look like, that's it. And it's worth looking at. There's literally multiple pages at the end of special permit conditions. And I think certainly David and the town has known this from the get-go. This ain't an easy thing, regardless of which route you go, just in terms of the responsibilities and obligations it puts on the town. I guess on that sort of maybe round peg and square hole issue with the Corps, I do firmly believe that the final EIS, and it's actually stated in footnotes and caveats, and I think Dow Cordy even had a slide on this during their project team meeting. The economic analysis in the final EIS is not intended to be a substitute for the town's economic analysis of what's in its best interest, whether it be cost benefit or balancing qualitative issues like aesthetics or otherwise. And so it's a useful document, and it sure as heck is a thick and long one, but it's not intended to be a substitute for the independent judgment of this board or any other local community.
Clark, maybe you could help me with one thing. On the ROD for Ocean Isle,
Yes.
I believe you mentioned something about the west end of Holden Beach.
Yes.
And I have not had an opportunity to review the ROD, but can you comment on that?
David, you may want to comment a little bit. I think Holden Beach actually did participate on the project review team for that proposed terminal groin. And the study requirements for that federal permit do include a non-trivial portion of the west end of Holden Beach. And, you know, beyond that, I don't know what involvement, if any, this board or others had in that process. All I can do is look at what's in the, you know, the final document. And we are a part of their growing process, whether we knew it or not, we being Holden Beach.
I'll read it. I'm just surprised I didn't know anything about it, but I'll read it.
In looking through this list, just real quickly, some to maybe.
Oh, I'll comment. Yeah, we were involved with the numbers, types, and kinds of monitoring that would go on as to what types of trigger points would be, what types of surveying, the actual process that would be followed to assess whether there were any adverse impacts because of the groin. And basically that's a three-party arrangement that the Corps chaperones with the engineering services of the towns and the Corps. Is that a fair assessment, Clark?
I think so. Be honest, I wasn't fully paying attention. I was trying to read my note. But real quickly, just looking at your table of contents, a couple of things I'd like to point out. Under tab 1, the last item is a paper entitled Coastal Erosion in North Carolina by Drew Hargrove. A couple of caveats and interesting footnotes there. I think when he wrote this, he was a second or third year law school student, and he's now an associate general counsel with the Department of Environmental Quality. It's kind of an interesting point, but it's an article worth reading. Then flipping on further down, the federal statute, the NEPA statute, there's no sense necessarily wading through that, but I did want to just put it in there. But the CEQ regulations are very important, and maybe I think they're more important than they are because I've been involved in litigation on them and dealing with the mobile offshore drilling project and military airspace and all kinds of things. But those CEQ rules are binding on the Corps, and they are often cited by the courts in reversing final agency decisions on the basis of inadequate environmental impact statements, or in some cases, failure to prepare one. A point worth emphasizing, though, is the NEPA, which stands short for the National Environmental Policy Act, is not a substantive statute in the sense of saying, well, if there's this amount of environmental impacts, you must, deny the permit. There's a great quote from the United States Supreme Court that's in your materials, and I'll probably paraphrase it wrongly, but basically it says that NEPA prevents uninformed agency action, not unwise agency action. It's simply a tool designed to make sure that credible, objective information on a reasonable range of issues has been produced and given to the decision maker and the public before any final agency action decision is made. So when courts review EISs in federal litigation on whether it's adequate or not, one of the first things they look for, and it often is something they find, is, was this document simply an example of 1,800 pages of reverse engineering to support a result that had already been determined? If they get a real sense of that, they'll invalidate the document. They will not, and that, therefore, they invalidate the permits that were issued. What often then happens is people go back and whatever the court identified as the 10 warts, and they go redo it, produce some information, and usually on the second go-round, the document can pass muster. But of course, as we all know, time is money, and many a project dies on the vine because of this inevitable seeming delay in the process of getting from point A to point B. Again, flipping through the table of contents, tab 9, to me, I find these pretty interesting documents. What these are is they're the minutes from one of the project review team meetings that was part of the process coordinated by the Corps and Dow Cordy. But you get a candid exchange of ideas and information from the different people there, because you have at those meetings people from the resource protection agencies, people from state agencies, interested citizens, from the Corps, from Dow Cordy, from Fran Way, you know, the engineering folks. And I think it gives, frankly, a better flavor of the pros and cons and what's going on than the darn EIS itself. And I think there's also minutes from a first project review team meeting, which you can pull from the Corps' website. I threw in tab 12 as just a letter from Oak Island to the Corps, just again to make the point that when each community is maybe doing one of these, the two communities on either side are going to be interested. And again, even if you are separated by inlets, there are going to be tensions and opportunities for coordination. And I think in this instance, there was some good communication and coordination, which I think David was involved in, to then result in, you know, a kind of a positive letter there. But the other reason I put that in is to illustrate what I think is sort of our coastal version of the water wars of the West. What we're going to have is more and more sand wars. We want it. And of course, when it's out there in some approved site, it's like Oak Island has specifically said is, hey, well, how much is left out there? Maybe we can get out there and get it first, you know, before you guys do, or vice versa. And so you have a little bit of the sort of classic environmental law issue, the tragedy of the commons. You know, you have a common resource and everybody wants it, and without regulation, the tendency is you try to get there and get it first so that before you lose it, quote unquote, to someone else. And I think we are going to see more potential for that kind of tension with these smaller communities that are separated by inlets than maybe the situation with Bogue Banks. You've got the various environmental groups' comment letters. Tab 19, I think the board had seen that before, but it's worth mentioning. I guess that's just a simple one-paragraph email from Jeff Gisler of SELC, pretty much saying, hey, gang, we're not going away. And it's sort of like a good CPA should tell you, you should never be doing a business decision just because of taxes. Similarly, you should never be making an important decision as a board just because of the threat or potential of litigation. But it is a factor to take into account. And I've had several conversations with Mr. Gisler, and, you know, bottom line is he has essentially, quote, promised that there will be at least as much litigation as has been filed by that entity in connection with the Ocean Isle Beach final EIS with regards to this one. And in that case, the town will be named as a defendant. They will not be the primary target. And in federal NEPA litigation, the town is not subject to an assessment of damages or I'm not aware of a single reported case that ever assessed any of the attorney's fees or costs, even in a citizen suit against the holder of the permit. That almost always, the target there is the federal agency, which in this case is the Corps of Engineers. But I think it's pretty well guaranteed that litigation will occur if and when final permitting decisions are made. And on that, the basic procedural point to keep in mind is that for a number of reasons, the federal legal system and the terms of the statutes involved is not nearly as draconianly short as CAMA is at the state level. But if the point I'm in my own rambling way trying to get to is that when a record of decision comes out, it will be sooner, not later, that suit will be filed. Because if...
So, excuse me, it'll be filed with the court?
Yeah. Obviously, litigation is, in fact, if you'll look, tab 32 is a copy of the amended complaint that was written and filed by Southern Environmental Law Center on behalf of North Carolina Audubon Society in connection with the Ocean Isle Beach final EIS and permitting decisions. And that, again, would be a blueprint of what, in essence, Mr. Gisler is, quote, kind of guaranteeing the town of Holden Beach would see shortly after issuance of the final record of decision with regard to the Holden Beach proposed terminal groin project. A couple of others that I would just point you to. Interesting, tab 24. This was a study done, published in the Journal of Coastal Research back in 1989 after Hugo hit South Carolina hardest. And there's a lot of science jargon in that article, but the gist of it is that when you have hardened structures either in the water or even intensive development right up to the shoreline, and you have a serious, powerful storm event, there are impacts on the topography of the near shore bottom that potentially have relevance to then how sand transport and erosion occurs after that event. There's not much, that's the only paper I'm aware of that sort of looks at that particular topic. The next one, number 25, the relevance of that is if you're wanting to be thorough and stay up like I did last night till 3 in the morning, compare 25 with the paper that Spencer Rogers and Rudy Rudolph wrote, which is in tab 28. 25 was done by the Division of Coastal Management or under their supervision, and 28 was, excuse me, I've misspoken. 28 is Dr. Pietrafese's report. The report I meant to refer to is the, bear with me, I should know this better than, it's important I get this right. If one of y'all sees it, I'm looking for the paper by Spencer Rogers, Rudy Rudolph, and one other scientist. I'm sure it's in here.
It's tab 26.
It's staring me right in the face.
Rudolph and Rogers.
Yes. So, you know, duh, I put them in there next to each other for a reason. I was looking all over. Compare 25 and 26. They're both reports on, you know, both of them deal specifically with an evaluation of the terminal groins at Oregon Inlet and Fort Macon, and yet they reach significantly different conclusions. They're not necessarily in conflict, but I think reading those two articles gives you a good snapshot of the range of the sort of scientific unknowns or different ways of looking at these structures. And then, of course, a hugely different perspective, just right there again together, 27 and 28. You got in 27 Dr. Coburn's sort of cost-benefit analysis concerns, and then in 28, you've got Dr. Lynn Pietrafesa's just blistering statements against the value of terminal groins on the shores of North Carolina. And I cannot help but add that I met Lynn first in 1988 when he was one of the experts the state turned to in connection with Mobil Oil's offshore drilling proposal, because part of his areas of expertise include huge ocean current issues like the Gulf Stream and the spin-off eddies associated with that. And so Dr. Pietrafesa has been doing this stuff for longer than I have, which I'm not sure if that says something good or bad, but he is a well-respected scientist. And again, that's one of the concerns that I have, just big picture-wise, is you've got this group of coastal scientists that have spoken kind of with one voice repeatedly for 40 years that this ain't the way to go. You then have the legislature say, well, let's give some a chance. And then you have to decide, do you want to be one of those first experimental guinea pigs or not, in the face of this competing and conflicting range of scientific opinions. What bothers me is how little of that is in the final EIS. The fundamental purpose of a document like that is to provide all the relevant decision makers with that range of opinion, so they can then make a decision that is informed. And I guarantee you, if SELC files suit, that's what they're going to be arguing, is that it's not, and that instead it's a wonderful piece of engineering and analytics to support a predetermined outcome. And that is always the concern you have about an EIS process, and if a reviewing court feels that there's too much of that in the document, they will overturn the permit. And the horrible tragedy in that is that it really ain't that hard to write an honest, credible EIS. But it oftentimes isn't done.
Mr. Wright recommended we go into closed session. Does the board have to do something, Mr. Mayor, to?
Well, I guess, first of all, decide when and how. What's the pleasure of the board?
I would agree, we go into closed session and have a discussion.
Yeah, that's good.
I want you to make a motion.
Does anybody in the audience have any questions for Mr. Wright before we go into closed session?
And I think, again, sort of the tidy way to do that, subject to Noel telling me I'm wrong, which she often does, because I need that correction, is this discussion we just touched on, the complaint that was filed by Southern Environmental Law Center on behalf of North Carolina Audubon, and the potential for litigation under NEPA and the federal permits. And it's perfectly appropriate for a board to go into closed session to deal with potential litigation matters.
Clerk has the motion language.
Just check that litigation box.
I was distracted.
We're back in regular session. No action to be taken, and is there a motion to come out of executive
I
session?
move so.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
We're out. We're back in to regular session.
You need to go back to the audit committee item that you had deferred to till the no got here. So,
She's gonna do that tonight.
Well, I can do it now.
I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah.
The proposal is in accordance with the Fiscal Control Act. So if the audit committee wants to do that, take those actions, and they can do so. They just can't change the requirements under the Fiscal Control Act that are already in existence for internal controls, specifically body to the financial officer, dual signature requirements, deposits being made daily, pre-audit certificates. They could never change any of that. But if they want to see if those things are being done, then the audit committee can do so. The local government committee can also do it, but they're not requesting it.
Could you specifically address the selection of the firm conducting the review would not be subject to the BOC confirmation as it relates to acquiring the services of an additional audit firm
It's not an audit, though.
in B? But that does require some type of statement of work, or, I mean, you're going to acquire them for something, and
If the board is going to direct the chair to request the town clerk to do a request for quotations, which is really a RFQ, request for qualifications for somebody to do this, so that then the audit committee can then make a recommendation to the board for selection. The board will make that determination.
okay, that was what I wanted the clarification to be, because I was interpreting that as the chair of the audit committee was going to be securing the services directly of this special review accounting firm.
That's the board action.
That-
The board should, the audit committee chair can make a recommendation to the board.
Right.
The board should select whoever this person is.
Right, complete with a pre-audit certificate and an appropriation from
Yes,
the
sir.
budget to cover
Yeah,
the
I
services.
misread that. I think the audit committee always asks the board to make the final determination.
Confirm.
Whenever you say audit chair, I guess that is with the blessing of the audit committee.
I am presupposing that the audit committee is meeting in accordance with the open meetings law, having a discussion, taking an action, making a recommendation to the board for the board's consideration. I think the audit committee chair is the person that's charged with the responsibility of communicating to the board what the audit committee, which is an advisory board, has.
The chair is the messenger.
That's correct.
The committee makes the decision.
And not to belabor that point, but in subparagraph B, the second sentence, if the LGC does not forbid the town from contracting such work, which your interpretation is that the town can contract for such work, the board should direct the audit chair to identify and contract with a qualified independent accounting firm. It's your interpretation that that's a recommendation that the board must be the contracting entity for that service.
Is this specific language that the board is considering adoption, or is this explanation as to why the board is taking action?
Actually, the second half would have been the direction of the board.
So what the board really wants to do is to direct the audit committee to do the RFQ, and then to report to the board on who the proposals came from, have the board select somebody to perform a review of the internal procedures that are currently being used within the town for fiscal control.
Correct.
And they should always be the audit committee, not specifically the chair of the audit committee. It should be we're directing the audit committee.
What the committee decides.
But I just wanted to be clear that that this is on an advisory recommendation basis, that the audit committee will basically do the work and bring it to the Board of Commissioners for award of a services contract to do that internal type, review type work.
Yes.
Okay, I have one other comment before we even think about anything else. I said this morning I wasn't sure what the rules are. I did get my answer from the North Carolina Treasurer
And from the town attorney.
and from the town attorney. The LGC does not conduct formal reviews of internal control or audits of any kind. We do oversee audit contract that the town is a party to. We're to receive a copy of the engagement letter, invoices, and final report. The board does have the authority to contract with your existing audit firm or another qualified firm to conduct a review of internal controls. So,
Okay, but that goes with, we have the permission to do it, but we still have
Yes.
to do it according to.
we gotta follow the rules,
the
but
rules,
yes,
right?
yeah.
So do we want to change this document so that it conforms to the rules rather than
Well,
have
the
it
only,
the way
it
it
would be
is?
the addition, as we agreed earlier, to add, the audit committee will propose to the board, the selected firm, to be confirmed by the board.
I would suggest, again, I know we'll always seem to be in a rush, but I would suggest that we table this until we get a document that accurately reflects what we intend to vote on, and that document is also given to the public, because like today, they were looking at a document that was totally different than the document that we were discussing up here. And, you know, it's my pet peeve, we've had it time and time again, we should only discuss issues that the public has had the opportunity to be aware of. And so I would ask, I would make a motion that we table this until we have a document prepared that accurately reflects what we wish to do and which follows, complies with the law.
You can do that at that meeting, the audit committee meetings, do.
Yeah, David points out we can actually do this at the audit committee meeting on Tuesday.
I'm fine with however you do it, as long as, again, as long as we do it correctly and as long as
Right.
people have an opportunity to know we're doing
Okay,
it.
the public will be in the meeting.
Yeah, I'm fine with it.
You can develop
That's fine.
Yeah,
Go ahead and do it. Get it done.
I think we're good with that then.
Okay, so table it until the audit committee meeting and add
Right.
it to the agenda?
Yep,
Everybody in agreement with that?
yes, sir.
Yes.
All right, anything else?